Hello, my name is Alyssa Bernstein, and I am substituting today for Becky Shining Bearheart as host of this program, LightShadows. I'm a professor of philosophy at Ohio University, and I'm also director of the OU Institute for Applied and Professional Ethics. With me today are Professor William Boyd, Emeritus Professor Richard McGinn, and local business owner Christine Hughes. And we are going to talk about fracking and a number of issues relating to it. By the way, the term fracking is used differently by different groups of people. Many spokespeople for gas and oil companies use the term fracking to refer to all methods of drilling for gas or oil, not only the relatively new methods, but all of the methods that have ever been used. But environmentalists generally oppose only a certain drilling method that was developed about a dozen years ago. Now, William Boyd is professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder at the law school. He has come to OU, that's Ohio University, at the invitation of the Institute for Applied and Professional Ethics because of his expertise in environmental law, especially concerning fossil fuels, renewable energy sources, and the history of environmental regulation in the USA. Yesterday evening, April 10th, Professor Boyd gave a public lecture at OU about fracking and some of the relevant legal, political, and moral issues. This afternoon, he will conduct an interdisciplinary colloquium on environmental regulation and risk assessment. Richard McGinn is a retired OU professor of linguistics and Southeast Asian studies. He specialized in languages spoken in Indonesia and the Philippines, in which he first got interested while he was in the Peace Corps. Recently, here in Athens, he has been working with the Athens Bill of Rights Committee, with the acronym BORC, which people will see in the newspapers or have seen. And he's been spearheading a citizens' initiative that will be on the ballot this November in Athens. Christine Hughes is a co-owner of two very popular Athens restaurants, and she has worked to educate herself and her community about fracking since 2011. Several of her food suppliers have been impacted by the industry, and many more are threatened with nearby injection well activity. Her restaurant, The Village Bakery, was created to help build the local food economy, and now the business is threatened by this industrial activity closing in on Athens and surrounding counties. Now, before asking the first question, I want to clarify the term fracking a little further. The environmentalists who oppose what they call fracking are not talking about the ways people drilled for oil or gas in this region in the 19th or 20th centuries. When environmentalists criticize fracking, they are referring only to a recently developed industrial technique which is used by large corporations. This new 21st century technique involves first drilling down vertically for about a mile, or even down to 10,000 feet, then drilling horizontally, and also pumping in millions of gallons of water mixed with various chemicals at a pressure high enough to split the layers of the shale rock and release the gas. Different companies use different chemical mixtures in order to make the water slippery or slick, as it's often said, so that it can more easily split the shale. But the mixtures usually include ingredients that are highly toxic to living things. The companies prefer not to disclose the ingredients, which they call proprietary secrets. Environmentalists generally oppose this horizontal drilling technique for a number of reasons. For example, because drilling each well requires millions of gallons of water, which is usually drawn from local lakes or streams or municipal water supplies, even in areas of the country where there are serious water shortages. And this water can never be used again for drinking or farming, at least for the most part, since it gets mixed with toxic chemicals and pumped deep underground where some of it stays. And the portion that comes back to the surface is not only toxic, but also radioactive and salty, and this, quote, brine, unquote, which it's often called by the industry, or wastewater, toxic liquid waste, which it is, gets disposed of deep underground in what are called injection wells. Environmentalists emphasize that the drilling for gas and also the drilling of injection wells and the underground storage of the toxic liquid waste all involve risks of contaminating underground sources of drinking water. Furthermore, natural gas is methane, which is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I think it's more powerful by a factor of 20 within a 100-year time frame, but maybe one of you can correct me. Both carbon dioxide and methane cause global warming and climate change, but a small amount of methane in the atmosphere has the same global warming effect as a much larger amount of carbon dioxide, ratio of 1 to 20, as Professor Boyd has just confirmed for me. These are only some of the reasons why environmentalists are opposed to the horizontal slick water drilling method they call fracking. I think I'll pose the first question to our guests from out of town, and I'll call everybody by their first name or a nickname they prefer. William, does the shale gas industry have any impact in the region of Colorado where you live, or in any other part of Colorado? That is there fracking, and are there any injection wells?
So thank you, Alyssa, and let me just say thank you again for the opportunity to be here in Athens.
We're very glad to have you.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be here, and it was a wonderful discussion last night. Colorado is experiencing significant development of its shale resources, both for gas and for oil. In the Front Range of Colorado, which is the string of communities including Denver and other cities like Boulder and Longmont, Lafayette, Fort Collins, there is quite a bit of activity around whether or not hydraulic fracturing will be allowed in city limits. There has not been a lot of activity in some of these jurisdictions, but they can see the potential for this down the road, and so I think there's a lot of effort to try to control this at the local level and take the time necessary to understand all the issues associated with it. In other parts of Colorado, in Weld County and then out on the western slope, there's a long history of oil and gas development and quite a bit of oil and gas development that's taking place right now in some of those areas. We do have injection wells out west that we use for disposing waste of all sorts. That's a fairly common practice, as it is to some extent here in Ohio and other states in the Midwest.
There's certainly a lot of injection wells in the state of Ohio, yeah. Christine, what got you interested in fracking or involved in the anti-fracking movement?
What got me interested was learning that the injection wells were becoming operational again. We had some old injection wells in the area from the vertical wells that have been in this area, but a farmer that I buy from started seeing a lot of activity right outside of his farm, and it turns out it was a reactivated injection well, taking a lot of out-of-state waste and coming all the time, constantly, day and night, to his farm, which is on a quiet country road, where he and his wife were growing vegetables and some grain crops and also lamb and pork. And so they started trying to figure out what was going on and learning more about the implications of it, because there was no way for them to stop it. They had no control over this injection well. And since then, they've had to shut down that farm and move away from it because they don't want to raise food with the possibility of contamination. The injection well has no monitoring around it, so they were paying thousands of dollars a year for tests of their water, the ponds and the water wells on their property, to make sure that they weren't getting sick and their animals wouldn't get sick, but they couldn't keep that up. So that's kind of what...
And the testing doesn't prevent anything from happening.
Right, but at least they could know better stop growing food.
All right. And Dick, what got you first interested in fracking or involved in your initiative?
Yeah, thanks. I worked overseas for 40 years, and I was involved with, when I got to Ohio University, I taught Southeast Asia literature, and my focus has always been on Indonesia and the Philippines. And one of the things that we see in the history there is a history of colonialism, a history of exploitation from the colonial power, and in the modern era, in the 20th century, it was industrial development, called modernization sometimes. But basically, the idea is that if a company or an industry can get control of the government, they can move into an area, move out farmers, build a dam, put in date palm plantations in place of farms, and the farmers are displaced. And in countries like that, when there's a protest, people get clubbed and sometimes go to jail. There's not a whole lot of what you call activism that is supported by the community, and as a consequence, it's a pretty dire situation. Okay, you fast forward now to the United States, and I retired in 2004, and I started to see, and I had sort of heard of this before, but I started to see the similar things happening right here. There's something called the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which allows companies to come in as long as they can get some control or some permits and support from local government. They can move right into an area, and if people don't like it, the structure of law seems to favor the corporations, and they apply various privileges that they have acquired over the years, and basically you end up with a situation like what we see here. Christine's example is a very good one, and you multiply that by hundreds and thousands of people that go, discover they're in an industrial development project without them having been consulted about it, and that they are pretty much politically helpless. They can't really do much about it. You have county commissioners that can write resolutions, but they can't pass laws, and local laws that are passed can be preempted by state law. So in other words, it's kind of like interstate bullying rather than interstate commerce when there's very little say-so on the part of the local community of what kind of activity is going to take place in that area. So all of a sudden the fracking issue became the one that was the most prominent here in Athens, and I'm kind of stunned to realize that our situation is very, very similar to these colonial people that I had been studying for my whole career. And it seemed to me that it wasn't quite right. And it seemed to me also that it wasn't quite American, that there was something about the American experience, about the American set of values that would say, well, wait a minute, people can control their lives. They do have a democracy. We haven't given up yet. We perhaps can fight back on this. We can decide what kind of industrial activity we want to permit. Certainly we want to permit some, but we don't want to permit activity that's going to be detrimental to our health, our safety, and also the economic development of the area. So that's really how I got into this. I just sort of realized that I needed to become more active and promote democratic solutions to these kinds of issues that have arisen.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes to tell us more about the initiative that you're advocating for. But first I wanted to go back to William. Is there much opposition to the fracking or fossil fuel industry in Colorado?
Yes, quite a bit. In some ways, Colorado is a perfect storm of sort of controversy around hydraulic fracturing, in part because you have a growing population, an increasingly wealthy population in some of the Denver suburbs and other areas that are quite interested in their sort of aesthetic and environmental issues. You've got a history of oil and gas development and extractive industries in the state that goes back to the very beginning of Colorado. Colorado essentially was settled as people came out looking for gold after the California gold rush. And a lot of areas in Colorado, including some close to the Front Range, were extensively developed for gold in the 19th century. And so you've now got a situation where the state has, I think it's quite clear, adopted some of the most progressive oil and gas rules in the country, and yet you've still got multiple communities up and down the Front Range in particular that are taking a stand and saying we do not want this kind of activity in our jurisdiction. So just this past year, and starting in 2012 actually, and so the last couple of years, you've got 4 Front Range communities that have passed either bans or moratoria on various aspects of hydraulic fracturing. So Boulder has rolling moratorium, 5-year moratorium. The city of Longmont actually passed an ordinance that heavily restricted fracking at one point, and then now has essentially banned it within the city limits. Fort Collins has done the same thing, and then Broomfield, Colorado, which is just south of Boulder, going towards Denver. Broomfield was seen as kind of the litmus test for this issue in some ways because, and the oil and gas industry made a big deal of this, because Broomfield apparently has a more sort of even Republican-Democratic split. And the vote was a lot closer in Broomfield, and they've had various recounts and it's being litigated, but it looks like the opposition to fracking prevailed in that as well. And now we've got a series of ballot initiatives that are in the making for the November election. In particular, there's an effort by the advocates for more controls and more local control over fracking to amend the state constitution and to provide communities with clear authority to regulate this kind of activity. There are a couple of lawsuits in particular that are quite important. The state of Colorado is suing the city of Longmont, claiming that the state's scheme for oil and gas regulation preempts the authority of the local government of Longmont to ban this activity within its jurisdiction. So there's a big fight in Colorado right now, and I think as we see in New York to some extent, in Pennsylvania and here in Ohio, very similar issues between the state government and these local communities that are concerned about this activity.
Christine, what have you been doing to express your concerns in the last few years since you found out that fracking and injection wells were coming to Ohio and to Athens County?
I started by speaking to the local elected officials, the mayor and city council, and so that sort of started the ball rolling as far as people educating themselves. Started bringing in presenters, people from other communities that had been impacted, such as a couple of dairy producers in Pennsylvania came to speak to a large group about the ill effects on their animals and their businesses from the production in Pennsylvania. We've had lots of visitors, which really, I think, makes a difference when people can hear directly from those who have been impacted. I think it's hard to get that across through films, and films can be torn apart and said, oh, this is propaganda. But when you have a real person, who's been harmed, and they really have nothing to gain, but to tell their story to try to prevent other people from being harmed, I think it's been pretty effective here in Athens.
I remember the mayor of Dish, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
You brought him here.
Yep.
That was an effective, very interesting
Yeah, I
public
mean, he's
presentation.
done, his story involves his young son starting to get nosebleeds, and I just met John Fenton from Wyoming, whose son also at a young age started to get seizures after the fracking moved in. And these are things that they can't prove, to anyone that's the direct cause. But when you hear their stories and you see them and you see people whose hair is falling out and who have rashes that won't go away, it's hard to say you must be lying, you must be exaggerating. It's hard not to want to help them.
And as I'm sure you know, there have been studies, and for the benefit of the audience, I'll mention that some of this data is available on a website which is maintained locally by the Athens County Fracking Action Network. If you go to that website, acfan.org, the tab at the top, I think it says resources or something like that. Click that and you'll see fact sheets where you'll find a lot of this information, including in a PowerPoint slide made by Heather Cantino for the LBJ event, which was a recent event commemorating the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Baines Johnson's speech about poverty. But thanks. You've also been doing other activities, including more recently, and maybe you could tell us about them too and why your efforts escalated.
Well, we have the support of our local our local legislators, and we have the support of the community at large to prevent this activity in the area. But once you go above that, above the county level, it seems that there's some blinders being used. Our senators and our representatives, our local representatives are listening to us, but they say that there's nothing they can do in the State House, which I've seen that is a pretty difficult situation in Ohio. But even above that, we've appealed to all levels and had no real results. And, you know, when there's nothing left to do and the existing laws are harming your community, then you need to take action yourself. So recently I did participate in a direct action activity, civil disobedience, physically standing in front of an injection well site in Coolville, about 20 minutes down the road, and stayed there after being asked to leave by the police. But I was prepared to stay, and I did stay along with 7 others, farmers and sustainable business workers, because our businesses are threatened, our livelihood is threatened, and our way of life, you know, our job security, and we feel that our water is also threatened. There's a great quote from a veteran of the EPA, Mario Salazar. He worked there on injection wells. He's a technical engineer, and he said, in 5 to 100 years, we're going to find out that most of our groundwater is contaminated. A lot of people are going to get sick, and a lot of people may die. So even though they're not perhaps poisoning us right now, I feel very strongly that in the future, it will come back to haunt us, and I have to do everything I can to stand up against that.
Just with regard to groundwater, Mexico City recently had to dig extraordinarily deep in order to find fresh water supplies. I wonder if you guys have read about that. I recommend that the audience do a little research, look into Mexico City and their water shortages. I'll come back to you to talk about the particular injection well where you took part in the civil disobedience. That was not the K&H well, number 1. Was it the site of the second K&H proposed well, or was it a different well?
They both have the same driveway, but they've both been permitted. K&H number 2 has been permitted, and they have drilled the well.
I see. There's been a lot of talk about the K&H wells, especially the permit issued recently by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources for the second well to be drilled by the K&H partners. The opponents, including the organization ACFAN and others, have pointed out that the permit was issued even though there was no geological analysis of the site, no seismic study, despite the fact that injection wells elsewhere have been alleged, with some scientific studies backing it up, alleged to cause earthquakes. There was no mapping of the local aquifer, no verification of a confinement zone to ensure that the waste pumped underground would not just spread without limit, no monitoring or disclosure of contents or radioactivity levels of what was going to be injected underground, and there was no monitoring of drinking water or groundwater after injection to assess migration and contamination. That is, no such monitoring is required by the ODNR. They issued that permit without requiring that. Thanks, Christine. Now I'll go back to Dick. Could you tell us about the Citizens Initiative?
Sure. I should start by saying that Christine is actually a member of our Bill of Rights Committee as well. And her action of being arrested in connection with that injection well is you might say, a preview of where we're all headed if these efforts that we take in the various environmental groups are not successful. That ultimately There were 8 people arrested last month. Next time it'll be 800. Next time 8,000. I mean, basically we've got to stand up. And as Christine mentioned, the state is not listening. You listed quite a number of things that ODNR has not done that it should have done. They also did not hold a public hearing. And their law, their own regulations, their own bylaws tell them that they're supposed to do that. Instead of having public hearings, which are official, they have what they call open houses, and they put the protesters behind a cage, and then they let people talk to the officials one by one, and that's very unsatisfactory. It's very arrogant treatment of the local citizenry trying to express their voice.
And it doesn't allow public discussion among the citizens.
It doesn't even
between
allow
them
public
and
discussion.
the officials.
Exactly. So what we have done in the Bill of Rights Committee is to draft an ordinance that will ban, well, it starts out, it's number one, it's a Bill of Rights. It enumerates a number of rights, including rights to clean air, clean water, safe environment, that are actually guaranteed by the Ohio Constitution, at least in the original intent, Article 1 of the Ohio Constitution. And then we use these rights to ban fracking, and the banning of the fracking within the city limits, that's the scope of the ordinance, is also based on these civil rights that we accrue to ourselves. And then we also strip corporations of their so-called rights. I mean, the corporations are claiming that they have personhood rights, they have right of preemption from the state of Ohio, they have the right
preemption.
Yeah, they have the right to do harm. That's what a permit is. A permit is a permission to come in and dig or drill or any other activity that could potentially cause harm. They claim through constitutional and state law and statutes that they have a right to come in here despite our protest. So what we have done is put an issue on the ballot to make this into a democratic question. Do the people of Athens want to have fracking activity, deep shale? This is, again, you did a very good job defining that. It's the deep shale, hydraulic, horizontal fracturing that we are opposed to. Do the people of Athens want that in their city? Do they want injection wells coming from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, into the city and dumped into our city, within our city limits? If they want that to happen, then they can vote for it. And if they vote in favor of this activity, then that will end the matter. I mean, basically, that's the issue. We think they won't. Christine mentioned that we actually have support. I wouldn't say any city official is specifically in support of our ordinance. That's for them to decide when they go to the voting booth. But in general, the city council, the mayor, and the county commissioners have all been very, very strong advocates of caution, of studies, of moratoriums, shutting down wells. The commissioners actually called specifically to shut down the Ginsburg well, which is in our watershed. It's on the Margaret Creek watershed that flows directly into Athens at the West State Street Park. Commissioners have asked for that well to be shut down. But as Christine also mentioned, when you ask them to do something, they really can't. Their hands are tied. They don't have the authority. They don't have the political power. And what we're saying with our ordinance is that the people of Athens will vote. They will pass a law. The law will be on the books. The law will have to be enforced. And the corporations and the state of Ohio are going to have to deal with that. That here is a city that does not want fracking inside the city limits, and there you have it. They now have to respond.
They have to respond, and they're perhaps likely to respond by taking the city to court. This might be the state, this might be a corporation that would take the city to court.
Well, see, I think we have a lawyer with us. I think most lawyers are reluctant.
Easy now.
Most lawyers are reluctant to predict what's going to happen. And I certainly am not able to predict what can happen, but I can tell you what happened in Mansfield. In Mansfield, they did exactly what we're doing.
In Ohio.
Yep, Mansfield, Ohio. And they were sued. And the name of the corporation, now this is really funny, it's called Preferred Fluids Incorporated. So Preferred Fluids Incorporated sued the city of Mansfield over their ordinance, which is exactly like ours, drafted by the Community Environment Legal Defense Fund. 5 days before the trial, industry backed out. They left. Now, who's to say what's going to happen next year? Maybe they're licking their wounds. Maybe they are planning an assault. We don't know. I mean, I can't predict the future, but Mansfield stopped them, and the court case never went to trial.
Monroe Falls is what I was going to bring up
Yeah,
next.
that's another one. Yeah, Monroe Falls is similar to Longmont. It's
in Colorado.
in Colorado. It's basic, as far as I understand it, because Longmont has been in our literature from Community Environment Legal Defense Fund as well. These are bans that are not based on rights. They're not based on bills of rights. They're based on just the city not wanting to have something in their city, and they feel like they have a right to determine their future. They are Americans. They are the democratic process, and so they just ban it. And then they run up against the structure of state law that can challenge that. So I think in Longmont and Monroe Falls, what's happening is that these cases are moving on into the Supreme Court, and they're being
State Supreme Court.
Yeah, the state Supreme Courts in both cases. And what these two cities don't have is a Bill of Rights that says we have right to clean air, clean water, public safety, public health, and that corporations do not have rights that supersede ours. Now, that is an issue that would be interesting to have that argued in court. But that won't be argued in court in these two cases, but it should be argued in court in ours. The corporations would have to say, yes, we do have personhood rights, and they trump the rights of your right for your right of clean air and clean water.
So that would be bad if it went against the city of Athens.
If
and
the state
strengthened the rights of corporations.
if the corporations have to argue, this is the thing. The corporations don't like to make this argument. They like to operate behind the scenes. If the law favors their position and the judge simply rules in their favor, the issue never comes up, and nobody learns anything about how the corporations have managed to win this lawsuit. But if they have to argue in court that their right to make a profit is more important than the people's right to health and safety, and it's also more important than the people's right to choose for themselves whether or not they are a democratic entity, they don't like to make that argument. And that's why in places like Mansfield, possibly that's the reason why they backed out. This is not the argument they want to have.
Would you like to comment on this?
Well, there's a lot to comment on there. I have to say it's quite interesting to watch these different legal strategies emerging in different cities and local communities around the country. Longmont is headed to court this summer in August, I believe. Arguments will begin, and that's still at the lower court level. I think most people believe that issue will eventually, or this case will eventually get to the Colorado Supreme Court, unless there's some sort of legislative fix or something else happens that would essentially trump what is happening at the local level in Longmont. There is some case law in Colorado that suggests that the state oil and gas rules would preempt a local government in this case, but those apply broadly to drilling. And I think an argument could be made that hydraulic fracturing is a particular type of activity. It's more specific. It doesn't exhaust the category of drilling. And so I think it's a harder case than maybe some people recognize.
Harder case
for
which side to win?
The state preemption argument. And it also raises all of these concerns that Dick is talking about in terms of local regulatory autonomy. I think, which is really the normative principle that's in play here. It's like how much control do local communities get or deserve, frankly, over land use activities within their jurisdictions. Many of us, I think, have a strong intuitive sense, a strong moral sense that local communities should have a lot of control over land use activities within their jurisdictions, and most state constitutions recognize through home rule provisions that land use is a local decision, right? It's a local regulatory activity, but there are some areas where the states have created these comprehensive regulatory schemes, and in Colorado we have extensive oil and gas rules. We have a Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, et cetera, and so the argument is that would preempt these local efforts. Now, the rights-based arguments, the community rights movement is something I'm not as familiar with. It is becoming an issue in Colorado, and it is part of the motivation behind this ballot initiative for this fall to try to lodge this or anchor this in the state constitution. And my view on this is that legally you're in a much better place if you can anchor this in the state constitution. I think it's harder for a community bill of rights attached to a city charter or articulated as an ordinance, if you will, to have staying power in the way that something that is anchored in the Constitution, in the state Constitution would. And I still think in the end you end up with a preemption fight, right? You end up with corporations or others coming in, or the state coming in and saying, you can't stop this activity because the state is the one that should be regulating this. That's really where the fight is legally, it seems to me. And it's a really important fight. And what we just saw in Pennsylvania in December, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court essentially held that Act 13, an act of the legislature in Pennsylvania, which was an effort by the state legislature to stop local governments from trying to control this activity, right? The Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that that was unconstitutional. And they did that by going back and invoking an environmental rights provision in the Pennsylvania Constitution that is somewhat unique or distinctive for Pennsylvania, but I think points out the importance of these kinds of provisions if you want to frame this around rights. So there's the rights issue, and I certainly understand what Dick is saying there and the importance of that, but there's also ultimately can local governments regulate activities within their own borders, full stop.
Could I
Go right
respond? Yeah, this is one area where I agree with William 100%. We realize that if Athens is acting alone, then it's in a fairly precarious position, but it's not. We're also involved. I am the county coordinator for the Athens Community Rights Network, or the county, and this is part of a statewide effort. The constitutional issue that's coming up in Colorado is part of a statewide effort to change the Constitution, and we are also advocating that. Our ordinance calls for constitutional change, and the statewide Community Rights Network is also designed to organize all the counties to develop home rule provisions for each township and drive those resolutions into the state constitution by advocating constitutional change, providing home rule for every community in Athens. So this is absolutely in Ohio. Yeah, in Ohio. Sorry. So this is actually very, very important. That ultimately we are calling for constitutional change in our ordinance and in our activity that is statewide. So Colorado is joining, also New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Ohio is also joining that group calling for constitutional change, but it's not on our ballot yet.
And the name of that group is?
It's called the Ohio Community Rights Network, and it just got incorporated in November of last year, so it's only been 5 months.
And just to be clear, too, this, as I understand it, would not say that every community has to do what Athens is doing or what Longmont is doing. They have the choice.
They only have home rule. That's it.
They have home rule, and they have authority over this. And so if a community decides they want to impose some heavy regulations or even ban this type of activity, they can do that. But
Bingo.
if they want to allow the activity, they could do that as well, as long as it's consistent with the state regulatory scheme.
Exactly. That's called democracy.
Yeah.
You spoke, William, of a hook in the state constitution. Now, our state constitution, I believe, has a provision declaring that the citizens have a right to clean water. Isn't this correct? Suppose that's the case. Is this the kind of hook in the state constitution that might be sufficient or offer some significant support for community bills of rights? In other words, what is the difference between that kind of attachment or hook to the state constitution and then perhaps a different kind that you might have had in mind? Did you mean that instead of independent municipalities declaring bills of rights for their own municipality, a different strategy, possibly better, you think might be for the citizens of the state of Ohio to reform the state constitution and add provisions?
So I think there is some language in the Ohio State Constitution that suggests some sorts of environmental rights. I don't think it's as robust in any way as the Pennsylvania provision.
That's
so
right.
The Pennsylvania provision is quite robust and quite clear in that sense. And what's interesting about the Pennsylvania case, this Supreme Court case that came down in December, Robinson Township, I believe is the name of the case, is that the state Supreme Court said that environmental rights provision in the Pennsylvania Constitution creates sort of trusteeship types of responsibilities for local governments to regulate activities that could have impacts on or harm the environment. And so that became essentially the basis for, as I understand it, rendering or ruling that the Act 13 effort to preempt local efforts or local governments from regulating these activities was unconstitutional. That's slightly different than kind of a strict home rule type of amendment to a constitution. So a constitutional amendment that said communities basically have home rule authority over these kinds of activities that harm the environment, et cetera. Obviously they are related, but the Pennsylvania one is really built on this foundation of environmental rights. I think there is some language in the Colorado Constitution, in the Ohio Constitution that you might be able to read in that way, but it's not as good of a hook as you have. And so that raises the question, as Dick was talking about, of a possible move to amend the state constitution. That's what's happening in Colorado in November, potentially. It may or may not go forward, but there's certainly a move to do that. And elsewhere, and I think that's shows a maturation or a recognition that if you really want to preserve local regulatory autonomy here, you need to have something in the Constitution that will allow you to preserve that authority over and against a state regulatory scheme here, or something that would allow local communities to go over and above the state regulatory scheme if they want to.
Well, that's a significant distinction, over and against versus over and above.
Yeah.
So as I understand, maybe I misunderstand this idea, but I think that the case for state preemption of local authority with regard to the regulation of, say, the oil and gas industry is something about how it's important to have uniform regulations statewide. But that doesn't say anything about the level of stringency or the level of how demanding the regulations should be, or how well they have to protect the health and safety of the citizens. And what you just said about going over and above the statewide regulations suggests that those statewide regulations might be viewed as setting kind of a minimum level, a floor, above which the individual communities might decide to go a little higher in order to make sure that the water, the air, the public health of their citizens are protected. And that would not be an inconsistency between state regulations and local regulations. So why would there be an objection to that at the state level?
This is a really important point, and I talked about this last night. It's interesting to listen to what the industry says when they talk about the distinction between state regulation and federal regulation. And their argument typically is, well, we don't want federal regulation across the board. We would rather have the states take the lead. And there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense, having different states dealing with different activities within the state. The basin characteristics are different. You have different types of operators, a different history. There are different kind of legal traditions as well. And so it does make some sense. But the argument in favor of federal environmental laws has always been creating a uniform system across the country, but in almost all of our environmental laws, with very few exceptions, the federal law sets the floor, and states are allowed to go over and above that if we want to. We think of this as kind of our basic model of cooperative federalism in the United States. And so a state like Colorado or California or Ohio or whoever could decide that they want to enact stricter air regulations, for example, and go over and above some of the standards that are established in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or whatever. It seems to me that you could make an argument that the state-local relationship should be treated somewhat analogously. There are differences, right? In the federal system, we have kind of a system of dual sovereignty between states and federal governments. When you go from state to local, the local governments essentially are creatures of state law. It's delegated state law in a sense. But I don't see a problem with making the argument that the state comes in and sets the floor, and then if a community wants to go over and above that, they can do that. That may undermine the uniformity for the operators, but it's not rocket science to figure out if a particular community has said, we don't want fracking, you're just not going to be able to frack there, okay? And if you want to go to a community that does want fracking, you can go there, and then the state scheme applies. So that doesn't seem like a huge inconvenience to me. And we've already got regulatory fragmentation out there at the state level, and so they're having to adjust to different state rules across the country. So I'm quite sympathetic to that model. I don't know that...
Would you call cooperative
Well,
federalism?
cooperative federalism is the way we talk about
State
it when we talk
federal.
about state-federal. But the idea is that the federal environmental laws set a floor. States can go above and beyond that if they want to, if their citizens decide that they would rather have stronger environmental laws in a particular area.
And so there would be an argument by analogy justifying municipalities within a state like Ohio going above a floor set by the state of Ohio.
Exactly, which is essentially what these home rule jurisdictions are trying to do.
That's right.
In Longmont, they said, we're not happy with the state oil and gas rules. We recognize that they're getting better and they're being revised on an ongoing basis, but we still don't want this activity in our jurisdiction, or another jurisdiction might say we want to heavily regulate it in certain respects with respect to setbacks and other kinds of impacts. So the argument is very analogous to a state going over and above a federal standard, a local government going over and above a state regulatory scheme.
Mm-hmm.
I've not heard a good argument for why that doesn't make sense and why it's not more democratic and fair in some respects.
So maybe that argument will get made if this new ordinance passes in November and then gets challenged in court, as it may do. The editor of our excellent local paper, the Athens News, in an April 7th editorial, the editor is Terry Smith. He set up an imaginary dialogue between an advocate of this ordinance proposal and somebody else who didn't see quite how it made sense. In that editorial, it was mentioned by one of those imaginary characters that Athens could request a declaratory judgment from a judge or judges to see whether this citizens' initiative would stand up. Does that make sense to you? What would it?
No.
What would be involved?
No.
Doesn't make sense.
I don't think there's anybody who's advocating that, and I don't know where he got that. But basically, the city would try to go to trial on this issue before the lawsuit shows up. It makes no sense. It made no sense to the lawyers that I talked to. It could be very expensive for the city to do a declaratory judgment. It's a trial situation, as far as I know. So it's goofy. It's a goofy idea that has never been proposed by any living human being.
Although we do use declaratory judgments in other areas of the law, and they can be quite important. So when there's a pure legal question at issue, and there are not a lot of complicated factual disputes going on, you might ask a court to provide a declaratory judgment. Tell us what the law is so we can move forward. A regulatory agency sometimes will ask for a declaratory judgment on a certain type of issue to get some guidance about where to go.
But that might not make sense if the strategy here on the part of municipalities such as Athens is to test the breadth or strength of the state's preemption.
I agree. I'm not suggesting it's the right strategy in this case. All I'm saying is that declaratory judgments are sometimes quite useful in other areas of law. I don't know specifically what the argument is for why you would want to do that here or not.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I would just say that I can't predict what's going to happen. We've established that, but this issue came up in an earlier article in A News, just as a quoting of somebody, and so we have been chasing down trying to find out who said that, and it turns out all the suspects denied ever having said that, and they denied believing that it's a good strategy, so we don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Christine, what do you think is a good strategy? Do you think that this proposed ordinance is a good strategy? And now I want you both to answer. Is it calling for a moratorium or an outright ban? And banning or calling for a moratorium of what? Is it all drilling for any purpose, or is it drilling for natural gas, or is it drilling for to create injection wells? And what would be the difference between proposing a moratorium and proposing a ban? Maybe Christine, you can say what you have been advocating or what you'd like to see.
Well, Dick's taken the leadership position in this issue. I've just been supportive of it because I'm supporting every effort to protect our community. This one, I believe, is specific to the deep shale, horizontal fracturing, and injection well activity. So I don't think it would impact the old vertical wells.
That's true. That's true. We specifically talk, the term I think is unconventional drilling. You need some kind of a handle. It's
Hydraulic, horizontal
it's the deep shale, hydraulic, horizontal fracturing. Deep shale already puts it down 2 miles below the city.
Or one or two.
Well, I mean, the Utica is 2 miles.
2 miles?
So it would be a desperate effort for a company to come in here and try to frack in the city of Athens. But if they do, we have an ordinance that says, no, you can't do that. If you don't want to do that, you're going to have to beat up on us. You're going to have to come in and declare that you have rights more than we do to have a democracy. So that's kind of our fighting position. But that does not say anything specifically. It does not mention, as Christine said, conventional oil and gas extraction,
old-fashioned 19th and 20th century
which is part of the scene here. It's part of the local economy.
Yeah, you could go around and see lots of old oil wells.
I just think, just to add to this, the more narrowly tailored the ordinance or the regulation is, the more likely it is to survive legal challenge typically. And so if it's referring to a specific type of activity, and if it's a moratorium for a certain amount of time as opposed to an outright ban in perpetuity, those kinds of tailoring aspects could make it more likely or more viable from a legal challenge.
Easier to defend.
It doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will, but it's easier to say we're only going after a particular type of activity that's fairly new, that we're not comfortable with, and we'd like to take 5 years or whatever to decide. So Boulder has passed sort of a 5-year moratorium, and the idea is that this could be a rolling moratorium, and I think legally it's a little harder to go after that than it is, say, an outright ban going forward. So.
Thanks. There's one more topic I want to try to squeeze in here if there's another minute, which is the relation between the natural gas industry and climate change. As we know, methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And a lot of methane gets released in the course of drilling and also in the course of transporting through pipes, I believe. I have some statistics here. In the Journal of Geophysical Research, an article by Peischl, just this past year, 2013, it says methane leakage rates from fracking may be as high as 17%. Also, it's claimed that natural gas is a cleaner fuel than coal. But if we take into account all of the leakage, that doesn't seem to be true anymore. There's a quote here from the scientist Anthony Ingraffia, who is at Cornell. When one looks at the coal-methane trade-off for electricity generation, the break-even leak rate over a 20-year period is less than 3%. Now, the way I understand that is, if less than 3% of the methane brought up from underground leaks into the atmosphere, then natural gas is no better than coal in terms of comparing these industries from the perspective of the impact on climate change. Well, less than 3% is a whole lot less than 17%, which is the estimated leakage rate, according to the Journal of Geophysical Research of last year. And furthermore, there's a former executive of the oil company Mobil named Louis Alstott, who has said well failure, well barrier and integrity failure rates in Pennsylvania are more than 1 in 20, which means that the standards for these pipes and wells are not being met. Also, there are a lot of indications that plugging a well won't work in the long term, so after the gas is extracted and that well is to be plugged, that supposedly doesn't work, but methane continues to leak. Also, when it is plugged, sooner or later the steel casing is going to get rusty, the cement is going to crumble, and we know that there are lots of imperfections and failures in the cement linings of the deep wells that are drilled a mile or two underground. Also, the shale rock gets fractured, there are fissures, there's evidence that methane comes up through those rock fissures, and this Louis Alstad of Mobile also says there's at least one study showing that 100% of plugs installed in abandoned wells fail within 100 years, and many of them much sooner. So maybe that's one of the most serious objections to the natural gas technique of fracking, that we're all suffering from the effects of climate change already. And according to the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are very few years remaining during which to take a significant, if not drastic, action to cut emissions of CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases. And pursuing the natural gas option doesn't seem as though it's advancing that goal of cutting back greenhouse gas emissions. Any comments on that?
Well, it's definitely advancing more fossil fuel use instead of developing the renewable energy that will be a free source of fuel to us that won't damage the climate.
Renewable energy, solar,
wind,
geothermal.
So if we put the investment that we're putting today in shale, instead put it into renewable energy, we would be 1,000% ahead of where we're going to be.
And
going
be better
at this rate, just dealing with shale, taking it as it is and continuing with shale. So I agree, that's the most important point.
And so I think Christine's point is a good one too. Even if there are climate change benefits from replacing coal with gas, and there's a lot of controversy out there about these leakage rates. There's a considerable literature that's developing around this. There's a very recent paper in Science magazine, I think in the February 14th, 2014 issue of Science, that tries to canvass a lot of the different studies that have been done. It is an area of active research, and it is a problem that we have to get a handle on if we do want to get these benefits. But even if we can get a handle on that, if we're going all in on natural gas in terms of building gas-fired generation capacity in the electric power sector in a big way, it crowds out low-carbon generation, and it locks us into some committed emissions in the power sector down the road that make it very difficult to decarbonize the power sector in the 2040, 2050, 2060 time frame. So,
well, I think we have to wrap up. I just want to thank you all so much for taking part in this interview. It's been
Thank you.
very valuable. Thank you.
We're on TV.
yeah.
Wow.